So let's learn more about Rust, and let's start with our first speaker. Our first speaker tonight is Nell Shamrell-Harrington, and Nell is very well known in the Rust community, has given numerous talks on Rust. I dearly remember the Borrow Checker deep dive, and thank you very much for that. That was really, really useful. Nell works at Microsoft as a principal software engineer and is also the lead editor for the This Week in Rust newsletter and podcast. So welcome, Nell. We are excited for your talk. The stage is yours.
Well, thank you so much for the welcome, and thank you for having me here. Let me go ahead and share my screen. There we go. Well, good. I guess it's good late morning from here in Seattle, Washington, though I know it's evening for many of you watching. Thank you again so much for having me here. It's great to be here on the show and talking about Rust, one of my favorite subjects. Now, as was mentioned in the intro, I'm a principal software engineer at Microsoft. I am a former Mozillian. I was on the Rust team at Mozilla, and I am still the lead editor of This Week in Rust. I have been a contributor to several different areas of the Rust ecosystem, and we'll discuss a little bit of them later on in this talk, but the best way to get a hold of me, honestly, is Twitter. You can tweet at me at Nell Shamrell. Now, if you are new to Rust, if you're tuning in today, really wanting to get started with coding with Rust, there are a few resources I'm going to recommend right off the bat. And the first is the Rust book, which is available fully free here at this URL. And then if you'd like to learn through hands-on work, I can read about something and kind of understand it, but I don't master it until I actually do something with it. So I also highly recommend the hands-on Rustlings exercises for that. I do these periodically just to remind myself of all the different concepts of Rust and make sure that my muscle memory is fresh. And then finally, as mentioned before, I recommend subscribing to This Week in Rust. One of the best things I see as an editor of this newsletter is how dedicated the Rust community is to sharing and teaching what they learn to others. If you write an article on Rust, I would love if you would submit it to This Week in Rust so the whole community can learn from your experience. These are great places to get started when you are learning how to code with Rust. The focus of this talk is less on how you code with Rust and more about how the decisions are made which define how you code in Rust. And in Rust, we make these decisions as a community. We work together on GitHub and several other venues, solving issues and guiding the technical evolution of the language. What makes the Rust community particularly special to me is that we make these decisions in a way that values personal maturity and empathy as much, if not more than, technical excellence. This has worked quite well over Rust's lifespan. I like to say we are not successful in spite of our higher standard of conduct. We're successful because of it. The benefits of our approach, how we do open source, how we do problem solving as a community, are not limited only to the Rust project. You might be watching this thinking, okay, so this might work well for the Rust project, but what does it matter to me or my project or my business? I'd like to answer that with a story. I've worked as a professional developer for over a decade now, and I remember coming into tech with a certain stereotype in mind. Do you remember the film Jurassic Park? My fellow elder millennials, as I like to refer to myself as, probably remember this 90s film, but I'm sure many others of you have seen it as well. There's this wonderful moment in it where one of the characters sits down in front of a computer and exclaims, "It's a Unix system. I know this." And using her Unix skills, she saves the day. I remember wanting to be that girl. I wanted to be the tech superhero. And throughout the 90s and early tech 2000s, as a culture, we really embraced the idea of the lone tech genius, the person who can solve any problem if they are given a little time, a little space, and a lot of caffeine. This stereotype still persists in some places and some communities today. And the problem with it is it misses a crucial truth of our current time. And that is that all the big technical problems that could be solved by one person have already been solved. Even though we may not have realized it at the time, those were actually the easy problems. Now we have to face the hard problems. And as our world and our connections expand, it's only going to get harder. This is because we have shifted from dealing with complicated systems to dealing with complex systems. Now, when I say a complicated system, I mean a system that is knowable. A complicated system has many parts, but the way those parts are joined together are relatively simple, as General Stanley McChrystal states it in his book, Team of Teams. Technical problems, including open source technical problems, used to be complicated problems. But if you got the right person with the right understanding of the system, they could solve nearly anything. However, the problems we face today are no longer complicated. They are complex. A complex system is not knowable. A complex system is constantly changing and is tightly integrated with other complex systems. Think about a system of microservices. Think about systems of hundreds of thousands of microservices that must integrate with each other and interact with each other as each of these services grows and changes. And a system's complexity is not limited to its technology. It also includes how real living and feeling human beings interact with it. Humans create these systems. Humans use these systems. Humans need to evolve and change these systems as the world evolves and changes. We need communities of humans to make these systems possible. And a good example of a complex system is an open source ecosystem. I've worked in a few in my time, and these ecosystems are sprawling networks of libraries, plugins, services, integrations, and much more. They are also made up of people, individuals and teams who use and contribute to the software. And this, of course, brings us to the Rust programming language ecosystem. As Rust was being developed, the Rust community summarized the design values of the Rust language in these slogans. Memory safety without garbage collection. Abstraction without overhead. Concurrency without data races. Stability without stagnation. And most of all, hack without fear. Rust is traditionally known best as a systems programming language, as the Microsoft Security Response Center highlighted recently. But that is not all the language is used for. Rust is also used for web application programming with frameworks like Rocket. These provide a very quick way to get a web application up and running that is written in Rust. And in the past few years, we've also seen Rust used more and more in game programming. This includes the Amethyst game engine, which is written in Rust and provides a way for people to create games. Additionally, Rust is also increasingly used in programming embedded devices. This is one of the most exciting uses of Rust to me, because the Internet of Things is only getting wider. And there is much more that Rust is used for. Since Rust is used in so many different ways, it has to evolve and be structured in a way that considers all of these different needs when we're evolving the language. The ultimate leaders of the Rust ecosystem are the Rust core team. And in 2018 at RustConf, they presented on the difference between open source by serendipity versus open source on purpose. Rust does open source on purpose by having a structured governance system. And that system consists of three types of groups: teams, working groups, and project groups. Teams have decision-making responsibility over one area of the Rust project. Examples of these teams include the core team, which manages the overall direction of Rust, the compiler team, which develops and manages compiler internals and optimizations, the infrastructure team that I'm a member of, which manages the infrastructure supporting the Rust project itself, including CI, releases, bots, and metrics. And also the community team, which coordinates and supports events, content creation, and conducts community surveys. There are many more teams. If you want to see what they are, definitely Google for the Rust language website and click on the governance link. And I'll tweet out a link to that after this talk. So these are examples of Rust teams. Working groups are a little different. A working group can be a subset of a team, or it can be a standalone group. And these have a narrower focus. They typically focus on one specific issue and then recommend decisions to the relevant teams. They inform the decisions made by the team, but they don't make the decisions themselves. Some examples include Async Foundations. That's a working group that I'm a part of, which is focused on the foundations of async functionality in Rust. Also, we have the Embedded Devices, Game Development, and WebAssembly working group, along with several others. I actually got into Rust by volunteering to be a part of the Rust Governance working group a few years ago. Then we have project groups. These are focused on a very specific outcome. They have a defined objective to accomplish. These groups coordinate the work on that outcome. And a good recent example is the recently formed Error Handling Project Group, which is focused on making error handling better, more accessible, and authoring additional learning resources on error handling in Rust. My experience learning Rust a few years ago was once I understood how error handling worked, it was magic. But getting to that understanding took a long time. So this project group is focused on not only making error handling technically work better, they certainly are focused on that, but also on how to teach people how to use them. And then each team or group has a GitHub repo associated with them where they document meetings. Meetings usually take place in a chat application, and they also include drafts of RFCs. We'll talk more about RFCs or requests for comments in a moment, and capture anything else related to what the group is working on. Most of these repos are viewable to anyone. And this structure, the teams, working groups, and project groups, these are one of the ways we do open source on purpose rather than open source by serendipity. These ideas also apply to community by serendipity versus community on purpose. Open source communities, or any community, can seem like they form spontaneously, and that is how they often start. In the early days of the Rust project, we would sometimes get a pull request out of the blue without any action of the maintainers that happened to implement exactly what the project needed at exactly that time. That is what I mean by serendipity. And it feels really, really good when it happens, but it is not sustainable. Like any organization or relationship, no matter how magical it seems when you start, you have to work at it in order to make it last. For a community to not only stay strong, it must grow and evolve. It must be cultivated and nurtured intentionally. It won't happen on its own. We must do it on purpose. Over the past 3 years or so, I've noticed, well, more than 3 years, over the past 10 years or so, I've noticed 3 common things that every community must do in order to last. And the first can be summarized as ask and point. We need to not only ask for help, we also need to point people to where and how they can help. In the open source world, it's just not enough anymore to tell a potential new contributor to pick up a GitHub issue and expect them to work through it completely on their own. Trying to solve any project's issue without at least some context, it's not only hard from a technical viewpoint, it also feels extremely personally risky. A new contributor doesn't know how people will react when they submit that pull request or when they ask questions, and it can feel very unpredictable. A way we do this in Rust, a way we ask and point, is through labeling issues as easy or good first issues when we triage them. These are usually fairly contained to one section of the code base. Someone can work through them without needing to know the entire project. Additionally, we also often assign an experienced contributor to serve as a mentor to anyone who wants to work on the issue. Having a mentor available introduces a feeling of safety. It lets contributors know that they have someone they can call upon for context and for help when they're putting together their first, second, or even their 10th pull request. Every issue of This Week in Rust also includes a call for participation section where we feature Rust projects which are looking for new contributors. Many of these projects have mentors available to help first-time contributors complete their first bug fix or feature. Once we have asked for help and pointed people to where they can help, the next thing a community must do is make a space in the community where people can work together and help each other. I first heard this phrase, make a space, also from the Rust core team. In Rust, we use a mix of chat applications, forums, and GitHub itself to propose ideas, discuss these ideas, help each other, and guide the forward evolution of the Rust language. Again, this is something we have to do deliberately, creating the space and making sure people know where it is, so they can interact with other people in the community. We have a few different gathering spaces in Rust which are used for different purposes. And the first form of communication is synchronous communication. This is classic chat communication, where two people are typically online at the same time and exchanging messages in real time. We use a Discord server primarily for discussing using Rust, and we use a Zulip instance primarily for discussing the making of the Rust language. These are great forms of communication when we can all be online at once, or when at least a subset of us can be online at once. But the Rust community spans over the entire world and over, I think, almost every time zone. And that means we also need to have forms of asynchronous communication. Async communication is especially helpful when you are working in a community where there's different language proficiencies. We do these through discourse forums. So these chat applications and these discourse forums, these are where we discuss Rust. Where we actually work on Rust is primarily through GitHub in the Rust Lang organization. There's lots of different repos in there, lots of different parts of the Rust ecosystem. These are the spaces where we gather as a community and where we interact with each other. In order to keep these spaces a positive experience and a constructive experience and a safe experience, we must set guidelines for how the community interacts with each other. And in Rust, we have a Rust ecosystem, Rust community-wide code of conduct. Any community that does not have a code of conduct should have one. I often describe having a code of conduct. It's like having an evacuation plan for a building in case of fire. You hope you're not going to have to use it, but if you do, you're really, really happy that you have it and that everyone knows what to do should an incident arise. Communication guidelines, they don't stop with the code of conduct, however. Communities will change, and part of executing that change without alienating the community is through having processes that ensure every voice has a chance to be heard. One of the ways we do this in Rust is through our request for comments, or RFC process. This is how we decide how the language evolves and how we operate as a community. When someone wants to make a change, whether it's to the Rust language or an aspect of the Rust ecosystem, or whether it's a change in how we function as a community, they write it up and then submit it as a pull request on our RFC GitHub repo. And to help anyone with writing their RFC, we include a template that every RFC needs to follow. This is a way of ensuring we get the information needed to guide us to a decision. And the sections of every RFC include a summary, the motivation for the RFC, an explanation of exactly what the change is, any potential drawbacks to that change, any unresolved questions, and future possibilities. This is a way of making sure it's kind of a way of equalizing each RFC in that each RFC has these particular sections, and we know this at least is going to set us up to have a discussion, a constructive discussion on that RFC. After the RFC is submitted as a pull request, then the whole community has a chance to comment on it. That's why it's called Request for Comments. And if you are thinking something that's open to comments has a potential to get unruly, it does. But the key to understanding our RFC process is the whole point of an RFC is to find the best solution, not to win an argument. What we found over years of doing RFCs in the Rust community is we often start by thinking our choices when someone opens the RFC are, do we do this or do we not do this? But what we found is that RFCs often change profoundly as they respond to and incorporate feedback from the comments. More often than not, when it first seemed like we had only two choices, we find a third way. A way that the person who opened the RFC or any individual person in the community did not have all the context to consider. The reason we depend on the whole community to respond rather than a select few individuals is because the most valuable comments we receive come from someone's lived experience. I first heard this phrase from Aaron Turon, who's a prominent Rust community member. Remember, as we discussed in the beginning, Rust is used in so many different ways. No one person or even just one group of people can hold all the context for all the different use cases for the language in our minds. We must have the context of the whole community in order to develop the best solution. Once the request for comments period is over, someone still needs to make the hard decision about whether to implement the proposal and how to do it. This decision belongs to the Rust team. Remember, teams have decision-making power in the Rust community, the team that is responsible for the relevant area of the ecosystem. Their job is to consider all the perspectives in the discussion and still produce a strong and coherent design. It's important to remember that comments on an RFC, they are meant to inform the decision. They don't dictate the decision. Again, the purpose is to find the best solution, not to win an argument. At its core, I like to say an RFC is a mission of discovery. It's a way for us to map the whole problem space before we design on a solution. You know, it's hard. It's sometimes really hard, but the solutions we ultimately create are so much better as a result. And if you'd like to see some examples of RFCs, one that is open right now, I expect it's going to be merged soon, is the Rust 2020. We're not in 2020 anymore, thank God. The Rust 2021 roadmap, which set out the ideas of where to take the Rust language in 2021. And then another RFC that I authored and have been shepherding through many, many, many iterations is one which adds async or adds streaming functionality to the async functionality in Rust. And if you take a look at this, you can see there's been lots of discussion. This has been one that's taken a long time to come to a coherent design on, but we're very, very close to it. So this is a good example of a technical RFC. And then another recent RFC, which is a good example of a community-related RFC, is the one that established the error handling project group. Project groups are established through the RFC process, particularly because a project group has to have a defined outcome they're working toward, and we can discuss as a community what that outcome is and whether it's the right outcome for that project group. What I'm hoping you take away from this presentation is that community is vital to every open source project, not just to Rust. And moreover, community is vital to every business and every industry, whether you're dealing with open source or not. Additionally, community is vital to every single human being. The best thing you can do as a member of community is start ripples in your community. Together, what we can do is limitless, but what you as an individual can do is start with small actions, small ripples in the fabric of our communities and our world. Remember, as ripples combine together, they turn into waves, and waves, as they combine together, transform into seas of change. Start a ripple today, and tomorrow, and every day after that. Thank you. All right, and I am going to be, oh, hi, Rainier.
Hi, Nell.
Hi.
Let's wait for Stefan. I think he will join us immediately. Yeah,
Yay!
I'm here. All right. Hey.
Nell, that was a really, really interesting talk. Thank you so much. I have to say, from my personal experience, when founding the Rust Linz meetup half a year ago, we weren't sure how it would go and how approachable the Rust community would be. And we were blown away. We got so much support, and it was so easy when we asked, for instance, that we would like to publish the videos on the Rust YouTube channel and things like that. We really felt welcome. So I can absolutely second what you have told us about Rust. So this is really a great community. Stefan, I think you agree, don't you?
Absolutely. And to add, it was a wonderful keynote. That's the stuff I go to conferences for. If you would be in a live audience, I would be clapping and applauding the entire time. It was brilliant. No, seriously, Ryan, I guess, just said it in the chat. We know all that stuff, but it was really delivered in a way that it's tangible and graspable for everybody. So thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. And please, if you have the opportunity, we would love to invite you to Rust Linz at some point in time. That
absolutely. I remember your first pull request to This Week in Rust to include Rust Linz there. Yeah, I remember. I don't remember every single pull request, but I do remember that one. And it was so happy to see the Rust community finding a home in another place in the world.
Thank you very much.
That is really great. I think, do we have a little bit of time for questions? What do you think? I think it was planned to start at 8:50, right? Somebody should stop us if we don't have time for some questions. Otherwise, now, are you fine if we ask you one or two questions?
Absolutely.
Oh, awesome. And I would invite everybody to use especially the Discord server to shoot some questions here. We will relay them to Nell. If you have questions, just let them come in. I have a personal question, because everybody who knows me knows that my heart beats for working with kids and young coders. This is what I do. I am chairman of the local Coder Dojo, and I do a lot of work with kids and children. What do you think? What do you personally think about how suitable is Rust and putting Rust into, let's say, high school or coding clubs with kids? I don't know, typical teenagers. Is that a good idea? Do you have some ideas in that direction? Are there even some resources that you have on the top of your mind for maybe some kids or teenagers who are watching this video and think about trying Rust for learning how to code?
Yeah, the first resource I can think of is the Rust Bridge project, which is, I think it's been a little dormant during the whole pandemic, but it's a series of workshops. It has an open source curriculum for getting started with Rust. My first instinct, a year ago would have been, I don't know if Rust is a good first language for someone to learn, but you don't have to learn the entire language to use it and to see its power. I mean, honestly, I would start off with embedded devices. I've been involved in maker spaces, and I've seen how much kids and teenagers and even adults really gravitate onto that. And you only have to know one specific part of the Rust ecosystem. You know the basic principles and one part of it. And the nice thing is, and I think Ryan will discuss this a bit in his AMA after that. I will gladly share that learning resource in the chat later. But it's a very safe language in that things that could trip you up as a younger coder, or even as a very experienced coder with the way you deal with memory, Rust prevents you from doing that. And the great thing about the Rust compiler is it doesn't just tell you when you do something wrong, it tells you how to fix it. And our community, one of the most wonderful things our community has done has made really, really helpful error messages that point people to the parts of their code that they might want to change, and also give examples of what they might want to do with it. So yeah, the compiler is a great teacher.
Yeah, and I have also noted the gaming engine that you mentioned during your talk. I wasn't aware of it, and I definitely have to take a look at it, because building games is an awesome way of learning how to code, if you ask me.
Absolutely. It's really fun.
Definitely. If there are currently no other questions from the viewers.
Looks like there's one that just came in. Can we expect beginner material on Microsoft Learn anytime soon? I believe stuff is in the works for that. And Ryan might be able to speak more to it in his session after this.
There's another question that I just got. Some folks have not seen many companies hiring for Rust without previous experience. Do you have any advice on getting to work with Rust as a non-Rust developer?
Yes. So something I've noticed is, working through the Rust book, even working through the Rust Links exercises, they were great to get started with, but that was only about 20% of my learning. The other 80% came when I started working on projects that use Rust. And best thing to do is to find an open source project that uses Rust. Take a look at the issues. Those usually give you an idea of whether it's a friendly audience or not. Though most people are fairly friendly in the Rust community, and start contributing it that way. If you're interested in game programming, find a GitHub repo that includes a Rust project that is a game. But finding those open source projects as you have time and as you have availability, for me, that's been the best way for me to learn and to get that experience on my GitHub profile that I can then take with me to interviews.
Cool.
Mm-hmm. I think that thinking about how to start, how to get started, how to make learning a language simple is really important. I sometimes see communities, meetups that only think about deep dives and the hardcore stuff and things like that. I think that is really valuable content for a meetup, but I think it's really important as a community, just as you perfectly phrased it in your keynote, that we keep in our that we keep this mindset of beginners, because without beginners, I personally think that a programming language is really very quickly becoming not relevant anymore. So I really love your thoughts about how people can get started.
Something I found when I started speaking at a lot of conferences is I would often aim for kind of mid-level with most of my technical content, and beginner to mid-level. And I always had maybe 2 people in the audience who would come up to me and complain, well, it was too basic. It was too beginner. You should talk about more advanced things. So I started talking about more advanced things. And then I lost everyone in the audience except for 2 people. Because many of them were there to learn the beginner concepts, learn things that they can attach themselves onto, beginner and mid content. And then maybe after that, they might be ready for some more advanced content. But there's a lot more beginners and mid-level people, I think, than people realize. And our job as speakers is to teach. And we have to teach to all those experience levels. Something I learned the hard way is that, speaking at a conference, it's about teaching. It's not about showing off my mastery of a subject. And I think that's something a lot of people are still learning.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. We have one question coming up. Somebody, Susanna, I think, was asking, you talked about maybe some material on Microsoft Learn or other learning material. If we have people in the audience who are not on a level where they can contribute to really Rust code, but they want to learn by providing some maybe beginner material, is there any way of the community to help with creating some learning material, documentation, tutorials, things like that?
Absolutely. A good way to get started is to, write up a beginner blog post and submit it to This Week in Rust. That'll get the eyes of the whole community on it. And there are definitely opportunities to improve tutorials for Rust, to improve the documentation and the learning resources. The Rust Links languages are completely open source. The Rust Bridge curriculum is completely open source. And honestly, one of the best things you can do as a new contributor to a tutorial or to anything is run through it and see what problems you run into when you're running through it, what concepts aren't clear, or whether there's typos in it, things like that. And then submit a pull request with those corrections, which make it better for the next person who comes to it. So I will gather some... Sorry, I'm laughing at one of the questions that just came in. I will gather some resources to that and tweet it out.
Yeah, this question is really great. People seem to love your background. I see BB-8, I see an octocat, I see a unicorn. So this is really a great background for video conferences now.
Yeah, a lot of those are collected from various conferences.
Yeah. I think there is another question, Stefan. I think this is one for you. It's about the fact that Rust is not talked a lot about in education. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Thank you for giving me a question. I wasn't expecting that, but I'm happy to jump on that. So Kat asks or says that Rust isn't really talked about in education, like colleges or university. So they haven't learned any Rust, and that's true. So I do some teaching at the local university from time to time, and Rust has been a footnote in a general systems programming course, and I volunteered to give a Rust course next winter semester at the university in Linz, which I'm very excited about. But it took me and a couple of other interested people to push it through. So it's about to happen. What are your thoughts on that? Do you see Rust being something that gets into the curriculum, or should we rely on open resources or paid resources or whatever there is out there?
It's starting to get into some curriculums. I believe, I'll have to look up the link. I believe Stanford has a course, which I think it's a 300 or 400 level course. It's definitely a more advanced course, but it is more about topics in computer science, and I believe they have several lessons on Rust in it. Also, it's important to know, the things that Rust prevents you from doing and why you should be prevented from doing that. That covers a lot of computer science fundamentals as well. So starting to see it. Haven't seen a ton of it yet, but looking forward to seeing more.
Yeah, you're totally right. So the computer science fundamentals are very visible in Rust. I have never thought so much about memory in the last 15 years or so, and now I can't get my mind out of it. So one thing that I'm also interested, you spoke a lot about in your keynote about community and compromise and working on ideas. And that's something that has drawn me to Rust in the very first place. So this was something that I could really get a hold on, and was interested in how the community works, just from a spectator's perspective. Do you have any processes or ideas in place to keep that vibe and that community spirit? Because Rust is getting more and more popular. Big companies are going to bet on Rust in the future. So the whole community and the whole ecosystem is growing fast suddenly. So what is in there to preserve that nice and warm and welcoming feeling that we get when we are learning Rust?
I think, from an enforcement standard, the code of conduct, but that's really about a specific type of behavior. That's not really about the spirit of the community. And, a lot of it in the earlier days came through RustConf and other Rust conferences. We've had to change things quite a bit in the past year due to the pandemic. I think what keeps the community spirit in Rust alive is connecting with each other on a human-to-human basis. So when that can be in person, that's fantastic. It can't always be in person, but almost all Rust meetups, I see them when I'm putting together This Week in Rust, are held online right now. I went to one in Dublin. I've gone to other ones, and the best way is by interacting with other humans in a way that's face-to-face, or at least voice-to-voice, or something to that effect, to remind you that there's a human behind it. And that often, when an RFC conversation starts to go off the rails, and that does happen sometimes, it's because people have forgotten that there's a human behind the screen. There's a human who's typing up the things in a GitHub comment. And once you lose sight of that, that's when conversations get difficult. But if you're aware of it, and if the rest of the community has led through example, you can be guided back to considering that person a human. So human-to-human contact, I think, is the best thing that you can do. And I think we've adapted very well as a community to doing it online.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a very important one. We have learned a lot in the past year in our communities, because we mainly relied on in-person communities. We had nice meetings, and we had a nice community here in our hometown Linz. There are some drawbacks in meeting online, but to be honest, in the future, I definitely not want to go back 100% in person, because we had so many guests from around the world. The world became smaller because we met people whom we probably wouldn't have ever met when we were just in place. I think when this whole COVID situation will be over, it will be a good idea to have this combination of in-person and online meetings, maybe keep it open, although that some people meet in person. What do you think about how the meetup culture was changed or will change in the post-COVID world, where it is possible to meet again, but will we meet again, or will we stay perfectly online?
I think, of course, we'll definitely meet in person again. There's no substitute for that. But I expect a lot of meetups to either do a hybrid model where some meetings are in person and some meetings are online, or I would love to see, a series of, not have the meetups be specific to a location, but have some global Rust meetups that meet once a month or so, where, people in a particular time zone, North American time zone, or Australian time zone, or as someone who's tried to coordinate meetings between people in North America, Europe, Australia, and Hong Kong, it's impossible. But having one of those meetups or so every month, or having one for each time zone, I think would be really, really helpful. So yes, I think we can go back to doing some things in person, but I think the online is here to stay.
Awesome.
Getting some nice ideas from that. So I want to chime in with Flo, who is in our private chat. I have also learned a lot in the last 45 minutes. That was very interesting.
I'm glad.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Nell, for doing this awesome talk, this awesome keynote. We really enjoyed listening to your ideas. And I think with that, it's starting to get time to switch to our next speaker.
Awesome.
Again,
thank you, everyone. Take care. I'll be in the Discord.
For being here. Awesome. Thank you very much. Great. Alrighty. Next up, and the next speaker will be Ryan Levick. Here he is, Ryan.
Hi, Ryan.
We have the honor to have Ryan as our first ever speaker.